The morning coffee slipped from Dorothy Bennett's weathered hands, ceramic shattering against the porch floor as she watched her 6-year-old granddaughter Grace walk 4 massive German shepherds down Main Street without a single leash in sight. What should have been chaos was perfect harmony, each 100-pound dog moving in synchronized formation around the tiny blonde child who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 2 years. Mrs. Henderson across the street dropped her newspaper, mouth agape. Car brakes squealed as drivers slowed to stare. Children pressed their faces against school bus windows, pointing at the impossible sight. Dorothy's chest tightened as memories flooded back. Grace's first night here, trembling and silent. The dogs arriving like guardian angels nobody understood. The bills stacking up. The whispered judgments. The constant fear that someone would take her away. Cedar Falls, Iowa had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but Grace Elizabeth Bennett and her 4 German shepherds had become the town's most puzzling mystery. The population sign still read 2047, though half the storefronts on Main Street stood empty, their windows reflecting the struggles of a farming community that had seen better days. Dorothy May Bennett, 78 years old with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, had called this modest ranch house home for 50 years. The mortgage had been paid off decades ago, but now property taxes threatened to steal away everything she'd worked for. $8,000 in back taxes, a fortune on her $800 monthly Social Security check. The foreclosure notice tucked beneath a stack of medical bills served as a daily reminder that time was running out. Grace had arrived 6 months ago, a broken little bird who barely weighed 40 pounds and hadn't spoken more than whispered fragments since that terrible night. Her blonde hair hung limp around hollow blue eyes that had seen too much for someone who should still believe in fairy tales. The state had deemed Dot the only suitable relative, though suitable was relative when you could barely afford groceries for 2, let alone 4 enormous dogs. Duke dominated the pack, a magnificent 8-year-old German shepherd whose dark coat bore the scars of service. His 3 companions, Belle, Scout, and Faith, ranged from 4 to 7 years old, each bearing an uncanny resemblance to their leader. Where Duke went, they followed. Where Grace went, they all went. It was a bond that defied explanation and frightened nearly everyone who witnessed it. The house itself told stories of better times. Faded family photographs lined the hallway. Dot's late husband Harold in his army uniform, their son Michael as a boy, and scattered images of happier days before mental illness and tragedy had torn their family apart. The living room furniture, purchased in the 1980s, showed its age but remained spotless. Dot's pride wouldn't allow for anything less, even when her arthritic hands made housework increasingly difficult. Financial desperation had become a constant companion. Dot counted quarters for groceries, diluted milk to make it last longer, and mended clothes that should have been replaced years ago. Grace seemed to understand their situation with an intuition that broke Dot's heart. The child would slip half her sandwich to the dogs when she thought her grandmother wasn't watching, her own small frame growing thinner each week. The dogs themselves presented another mystery. Despite their size and intimidating appearance, they moved with the precision of a trained unit. Duke positioned himself at Grace's right side, Belle to her left, while Scout and Faith flanked the rear. They never pulled, never strayed, never showed aggression toward anything except perceived threats to Grace. Their dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with an alertness that suggested training far beyond what any civilian might provide. Yet for all their protective instincts, the dogs showed remarkable gentleness with Grace, allowing her to use Duke as a pillow during her frequent nightmares, accepting her whispered secrets with patient ears, and somehow understanding that this fragile child was their most precious responsibility. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Bobby Chen decided he'd had enough. standing at his kitchen window with his morning coffee, watching Grace and her 4 massive companions make their daily pilgrimage down Maple Street. Something inside him snapped. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his 8-year-old son Tommy, and every day since then had been a struggle to make sense of a world that could take innocent children while allowing potential dangers to roam freely. Bobby had served on the Cedar Falls Town Council for 12 years, long enough to know when something didn't sit right with the community. Phone calls had been trickling in for weeks. Concerned parents, elderly residents who crossed the street when they saw the pack approaching, business owners worried about liability. The sight of a 6-year-old girl controlling 4 German shepherds without leashes violated every principle of public safety he'd sworn to uphold. "It's not natural," he muttered to his wife Sarah as she prepared for her shift at the hospital. "A child that age shouldn't be able to control animals like that. There's something wrong with this whole situation." Sarah Chen, a pediatric nurse who'd seen her share of unusual cases, looked up from packing her lunch. "Maybe the little girl just has a special way with animals. Some children do. Or maybe that old woman is using those dogs to intimidate people into staying away. You think about it, nobody talks to them, nobody visits. What if there's abuse going on, and those dogs are keeping witnesses at bay?" The seed of suspicion, once planted, grew rapidly. Bobby began paying closer attention during his morning runs, noting how the dogs seemed to anticipate Grace's movements before she made them, how they positioned themselves protectively when any adult approached. Most disturbing was Grace herself. Too thin, too quiet, communicating with the animals in whispers no one else could hear. By Thursday, Bobby had gathered enough support to call an emergency town council meeting. Helen Crawford, a retired school administrator whose own children had long since moved away, readily joined his cause. "I've lived in this town for 65 years, she proclaimed at the hastily arranged gathering in the community center. "Never once have I seen a child allowed to parade dangerous animals through our streets like some kind of circus act." The opposition came primarily from Martha Williams, an 82-year-old former elementary school teacher whose sharp mind had lost none of its edge in retirement. "What I see," she said, rising slowly from her folding chair, "is a traumatized child who's found comfort with animals. Since when did this community start punishing people for being different?" Pastor David Miller of Cedar Falls Methodist nodded his agreement. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, folks. Maybe instead of looking for problems, we should be asking how we can help this family." But Bobby's grief-fueled determination proved more powerful than appeals to compassion. He'd done his research, printing out statistics about dog attacks, liability issues, and municipal responsibilities. Standing before the gathered crowd of 37 residents, he presented his case with the passion of a prosecutor. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking you to be heartless. I'm asking you to be responsible. These are not normal pets. They're uncontrolled weapons. What happens when one of them decides that child isn't enough entertainment? What happens when they turn on our children?" The room erupted in heated debate. Farmers who understood working dogs argued against city dwellers who saw only danger. Elderly residents split between those who remembered when communities supported struggling families and those who prioritized their own safety above all else. The formal complaint Bobby filed the next morning cited multiple municipal codes and demanded immediate action. Within hours, the story had reached the Cedar Falls Gazette, whose editor saw an opportunity to boost circulation with a front-page story titled, "Are Our Children Safe? Unleashed Dogs Roam City Streets." For Dot Bennett, the newspaper article felt like a physical blow. Sitting at her kitchen table with the morning paper spread before her, she read the anonymous quotes from concerned citizens who questioned her fitness as a guardian. The article mentioned Grace by name, describing her as a withdrawn child who appears underweight and uncommunicative with adults. Grace found her grandmother crying over the newspaper, though she couldn't read the words that had caused such pain. The 6-year-old's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She began dividing her already meager breakfast portions even smaller, sneaking bites to Duke when she thought Dot wasn't looking. That afternoon brought the first official visit from Animal Control Officer Janet Rodriguez, a kind woman in her 40s who'd spent 15 years dealing with genuinely dangerous situations. She arrived expecting to find neglected animals and an irresponsible owner, but what she discovered instead troubled her in an entirely different way. The dogs were clearly well cared for, their coats healthy and their behavior impeccable. Grace showed no fear of the animals, quite the opposite. When Officer Rodriguez attempted to separate one of the dogs from the child for examination, Grace's distress was immediate and severe, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow until Duke was returned to her side. "Mrs. Bennett," Rodriguez said quietly as they stood on the front porch, "I'm not seeing any violations here, but I have to ask, have you considered that this arrangement might not be sustainable? The community pressure isn't going to disappear." Dot's response came from a place of exhaustion and desperation. "Officer, these dogs aren't pets. They're her protectors. And if this town can't understand that, then maybe we don't belong here after all." The turning point arrived with the harsh fluorescent lighting of the Cedar Falls Community Center on a humid Wednesday evening. 43 residents packed into folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation and anxiety. Bobby Chen had spent the week gathering signatures on a petition demanding immediate enforcement of the city's leash laws, while Pastor Miller had quietly organized his own group of supporters to defend the Bennett family. Dot sat in the back corner with Grace pressed against her side, the child's small hand clutching the fabric of her grandmother's worn cardigan. They'd left the dogs at home, though Duke had whined pitifully as they walked away, his dark eyes following their departure with obvious distress. Grace hadn't spoken a word during the 10-minute walk to the community center, but her grandmother felt the tremors running through the small body beside her. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a practical woman in her 60s who'd been hoping to avoid this confrontation entirely, called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. "We're here tonight to discuss concerns about unleashed dogs in our community. I want to remind everyone that we're talking about our neighbors here, so let's keep this civil." Bobby Chen rose first, his prepared statement crisp with legal terminology and barely contained emotion. "Madam Mayor, fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight not as someone who hates dogs or dislikes the Bennett family, but as someone who believes in public safety above all else. 3 weeks ago, I documented a 6-year-old child walking 4 German Shepherds, each weighing over 80 pounds, down Main Street without any restraint whatsoever." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Now, I've done my homework. German Shepherds were bred as working dogs, often used in police and military applications precisely because of their strength and protective instincts. When these animals decide to protect, they don't hesitate. They act." Helen Crawford nodded vigorously from the 3rd row. "I witnessed one of these incidents myself. The dogs formed what I can only describe as a defensive formation when Frank Peterson approached them near the post office. That behavior is trained, not natural. It suggests these animals have been conditioned for aggression." Martha Williams struggled to her feet, her cane tapping against the linoleum floor. "Helen, with all due respect, what you witnessed was 4 dogs protecting a child they love. Have any of you actually seen these animals display aggression toward anyone? Have they growled, snapped, or shown any sign of danger?" "That's not the point," Bobby shot back, his voice rising. "We don't wait for an attack to happen before we act. Prevention is our responsibility as a community." From her corner seat, Dot watched the debate with growing dread. She could feel Grace shrinking smaller beside her, the child's breathing becoming shallow and rapid. This was exactly what they'd tried to avoid, becoming the center of controversy, drawing attention to their fragile situation. Pastor Miller stood, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension. "I've had the privilege of observing this family over the past several months. What I see is a grandmother doing her best to care for a traumatized child, and animals providing comfort that we humans have failed to offer. Where's our Christian compassion in all this?" The room erupted in competing voices. Farmers who understood working animals defended the dog's behavior, while suburban residents worried about property values and insurance liability. Elderly residents split along generational lines, those who remembered community support during hard times versus those who prioritized personal security. Jennifer Martinez, the county social worker assigned to Grace's case, had been observing quietly from the side of the room. Now she stepped forward, her professional demeanor commanding attention. "If I may address the room, I've conducted 2 home visits with the Bennett family. While I can't discuss specific details due to privacy laws, I can say that I found no evidence of neglect or abuse. The child appears to have a unique bond with these animals that may actually be beneficial to her emotional development." Bobby's face flushed with frustration. "Ms. Martinez, with respect, emotional development doesn't matter if someone gets hurt. We have insurance liability to consider, municipal responsibility. What happens when one of these dogs injures a child? Who's liable then? What happens when we traumatize this child further by separating her from the only source of comfort she has?" Martha Williams shot back. "Some of you seem to have forgotten what it means to be neighbors." The debate continued for another hour, voices growing sharper as positions hardened. Several residents shared stories of dog attacks they'd heard about on the news, while others recounted positive experiences with well-trained animals. The division wasn't clean. Families found themselves on opposite sides, friendships strained by competing priorities. Finally, Mayor Hendricks called for order. "Here's what's going to happen. The City Council will review our current ordinances regarding animal control. Mrs. Bennett, you'll receive formal notification of any requirements or restrictions within 72 hours. This meeting is adjourned." As the room began to empty, Dot noticed several residents avoiding eye contact while others approached with expressions of support. Mrs. Thompson from the grocery store slipped her a $20 bill with a whispered, "For Grace." But she also overheard Helen Crawford telling a small group, "Mark my words, we'll regret not acting sooner." The walk home felt longer than usual, Grace's silence more profound than before. Dot's arthritis ached with the evening humidity, but more painful was the realization that their quiet life was about to become much more complicated. As they approached their street, she could see Duke's silhouette in the front window, waiting for their return. 3 blocks away, Bobby Chen sat in his car outside the community center, cell phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a potential safety hazard involving unleashed dogs and a minor child. The local authorities haven't been responsive, so I think we need state intervention." The caller on the other end took down the details methodically: address, names, specific concerns about child welfare and public safety. By morning, new players would enter the game, and the stakes would be considerably higher. Grace's whispered words to Duke that night, overheard through thin walls, would haunt Dot for weeks to come. "They want to take you away, don't they? Just like they took Mommy." The official notice arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by a nervous postal worker who'd clearly heard about the controversy surrounding the Bennett house. Dot's hands trembled as she read the formal language demanding compliance with municipal leash laws within 72 hours. But it was the second envelope that made her sink into her kitchen chair with despair. The foreclosure proceedings had accelerated. 30 days to pay the full $8,000 in back taxes or lose the house that had been her home for half a century. Grace found her grandmother at the kitchen table an hour later, surrounded by scattered bills and legal documents. The 6-year-old couldn't read the words, but she understood tears well enough. Without speaking, she climbed into Dot's lap and pressed her small face against the older woman's shoulder. Duke materialized beside them, resting his massive head on Dot's knee with the intuitive understanding that comfort was needed. "What are we going to do, baby girl?" Dot whispered into Grace's blonde hair. "I don't know how to fix this mess." The weekend brought a parade of visitors, each with their own agenda. Martha Williams arrived Saturday morning with a casserole and a folder full of legal research she'd printed at the library. "There are exceptions for service animals and therapy dogs," she explained, spreading papers across Dot's dining room table. "If we can prove these dogs serve a therapeutic purpose for Grace, the leash laws might not apply." Pastor Miller followed that afternoon, bringing news that his congregation had started a collection. "We've raised $400 so far," he said, pressing an envelope into Dot's hands. "It's not much, but it's a start toward those taxes." But for every supportive visitor, there seemed to be 2 new problems. Helen Crawford had organized a petition of her own demanding stricter enforcement of animal control laws. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services had intensified, with complaints about Grace's apparent malnourishment and the dangerous living conditions she endured. By Monday morning, the pressure had taken its toll on the entire household. Grace had stopped eating altogether, sharing every bite of food with the dogs when she thought Dot wasn't watching. The child's already thin frame had become skeletal, her clothes hanging loose on her small body. Duke rarely left her side now, his alert eyes constantly scanning for threats that seemed to multiply daily. Dr. Sarah Kim, the child psychologist assigned to evaluate Grace's case, arrived Tuesday afternoon with Jennifer Martinez in tow. A gentle woman in her 40s with kind eyes and infinite patience, Dr. Kim had spent 20 years working with traumatized children. Still, Grace's case presented unique challenges. "Hello, Grace, Doctor," Kim said softly, settling cross-legged on the living room floor rather than taking the offered chair. "I'm Sarah. I work with children who've had scary things happen to them." Grace pressed closer to Duke, her small hand buried in his thick fur. The dog remained perfectly still, though his ears tracked every movement in the room. Belle, Scout, and Faith positioned themselves in a loose semicircle, creating a protective barrier between Grace and the strangers. "Those are beautiful dogs," Dr. Kim continued, her voice remaining calm and non-threatening. "Duke looks like he takes very good care of you." For the first time, Grace's eyes flickered with interest. She whispered something so softly that only Duke could hear, and the big dog's tail moved slightly, not a wag exactly, but an acknowledgement. Jennifer Martinez took notes as Dr. Kim spent 2 hours observing the family dynamics. What she witnessed defied conventional understanding of pet-owner relationships. The dogs didn't just respond to Grace, they anticipated her needs. When the child showed signs of anxiety during questioning, Duke would shift position to provide better physical support. When Grace became overwhelmed and began to hyperventilate, Belle moved closer and began a low, rhythmic panting that seemed to help regulate the child's breathing. "This isn't typical animal behavior," Dr. Kim murmured to Jennifer as they prepared to leave. "These dogs are displaying therapeutic responses that usually require extensive training. I need to do more research before I make any recommendations." That evening brought news that shattered what remained of Dot's composure. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, a wealthy, childless couple from Des Moines, had contacted Child Services expressing interest in adopting Grace. They owned a spacious home in an upscale suburb, both held advanced degrees, and their financial resources could provide educational opportunities that Dot's meager Social Security could never match. They seem like wonderful people, Jennifer Martinez explained during her phone call. They've been approved for adoption before, though the previous placement fell through due to circumstances beyond their control. What Jennifer didn't mention was the single complaint in the Harrisons' file, an allegation from a nephew about aggressive discipline methods that had been investigated but never substantiated. The complaint had been filed by a teenager with a history of behavioral problems, and the caseworker had ultimately dismissed it as unfounded. The Harrisons visited on Thursday, arriving in a gleaming SUV that probably cost more than Dot's annual income. Richard Harrison, a successful architect in his early 50s, wore the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His wife Susan, a former teacher turned philanthropist, had done extensive research on childhood trauma and spoke knowledgeably about therapeutic interventions. "We understand Grace has been through terrible experiences," Susan said, her voice filled with practiced empathy. "We're prepared to provide whatever support she needs. Therapy, tutoring, medical care. We have the resources to give her every opportunity." Grace's reaction to the Harrisons was curious, not the fearful withdrawal she typically showed with strangers, but something closer to resignation. She answered their questions in whispered monosyllables and allowed Susan to examine the drawings she'd made in art therapy. When Richard knelt to her eye level and spoke about the beautiful bedroom they'd prepared, Grace nodded politely. "She's such a sweet, well-behaved child," Susan told Dot. "With proper nutrition and stability, she'll thrive." The dog's behavior during the visit was subtly different from their usual protective stance. They remained alert, but showed none of their typical signs of aggression or territorial behavior. Duke stayed close to Grace but didn't interpose himself between her and the visitors. It was Belle who seemed most unsettled, moving restlessly around the room and occasionally whining softly. That night, Dot overheard Grace talking to Duke in the darkness of her bedroom. "They have a big house and lots of money," the child whispered. "Grandma Dot wouldn't have to worry about me anymore. But you can't come with me, can you? They said you're too big for their house." The financial pressure reached a breaking point when the utilities company delivered a disconnection notice. Without electricity, the house would become uninhabitable, giving Child Services additional grounds to remove Grace from Dot's care. The older woman sat at her kitchen table that night, counting and recounting the meager funds in her checking account. Even with the congregation's generous donations, she was still over $6,000 short of saving their home. Dr. Kim returned Friday with her preliminary assessment and a troubling discovery. During her research into Grace's case, she'd found references to the night Grace's mother died, references that mentioned a police K-9 unit's involvement in the response. When she'd tried to follow up on these details, however, she'd encountered bureaucratic walls and missing paperwork. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Kim said carefully, "I need to ask you about Duke's background. Where did he come from? How long have you had him?" Dot's hesitation was telling. He came to us after Grace's mother died." The child was so traumatized, and Duke seemed to be the only one who could calm her down. "Was Duke part of the police response that night?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Dot looked toward the living room where Grace sat with the 4 dogs, all of them arranged in their usual protective formation. "Dr. Kim, there are some things that are better left in the past. That child has been through enough. I understand your desire to protect Grace, but if Duke has special training or background that could help her case—" "What I know," Dot said firmly, "is that these dogs saved my granddaughter's life in more ways than one. Everything else is just paperwork." The weekend brought the most devastating blow yet. Grace collapsed during their Saturday morning walk, her weakened body finally succumbing to weeks of inadequate nutrition and stress. Duke caught her as she fell, his powerful frame supporting her until Dot could reach them. Neighbors who witnessed the incident called for an ambulance, and within minutes, Grace was being rushed to Cedar Falls General Hospital. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Rebecca Thompson, was blunt in her assessment. This child is severely malnourished and dehydrated. Her blood sugar is dangerously low, and she's showing signs of failure to thrive. We need to admit her immediately. "Can the dogs visit?" Dot asked desperately, watching Grace's pale face on the hospital bed. "She won't recover without them." "Ma'am, this is a hospital, not a kennel. We have strict policies about animals." Grace's condition deteriorated rapidly without Duke's presence. She refused to eat the hospital food, became increasingly agitated when medical staff approached, and retreated into a catatonic state that terrified everyone involved. Her vital signs remained unstable, and Dr. Thompson began talking about psychiatric evaluation and potential long-term care. Bobby Chen heard about Grace's hospitalization and felt the first crack in his certainty. Standing outside the hospital that Sunday evening, watching Dot pace the parking lot because she couldn't bear to leave, but had no choice with visiting hours over, he remembered his own vigils during Tommy's final weeks. The helplessness, the desperate prayers, the crushing weight of watching a child suffer. "Maybe I was wrong," he whispered to Sarah as they drove home. "Maybe those dogs aren't the danger here." Inside the hospital, Grace lay curled in her narrow bed, staring at the window with empty eyes. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly alone. The clinical smells, the harsh lighting, the constant noise of monitors and overhead pages, everything reminded her of that terrible night when her world had ended. In the darkness of her room, she whispered words that no one heard. "Duke, I need you. Please don't let them keep us apart forever." The crisis reached its peak on a gray Monday morning when Grace's condition took a dangerous turn. Dr. Rebecca Thompson found herself facing a medical puzzle that defied conventional treatment protocols. The 6-year-old's vital signs had become increasingly unstable over the weekend, her blood pressure dropping to alarming levels while her heart rate remained erratic. Most troubling was her complete refusal to eat or drink, despite the medical team's best efforts to encourage cooperation. "In 30 years of pediatric medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Thompson confided to Jennifer Martinez during their hallway consultation. "The child shows no signs of organic illness, but she's failing as surely as if she had a terminal diagnosis. It's as if she's simply given up." Grace lay motionless in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. The cheerful pediatric decorations, cartoon animals and rainbow murals, might as well have been invisible. She hadn't spoken since her admission, hadn't acknowledged the parade of doctors, nurses, and social workers who'd attempted to engage her. The only sign of awareness came when someone mentioned the dogs. Then, her breathing would quicken slightly, and tears would slide silently down her cheeks. Dot spent every possible moment at Grace's bedside, sleeping in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and surviving on vending machine coffee and whatever food the compassionate nursing staff smuggled to her. Her own health was deteriorating under the stress. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously high, and the persistent chest pains she'd been ignoring could no longer be dismissed as mere anxiety. "Mrs. Bennett, you need to take care of yourself," urged Nancy Coleman, the head nurse who'd become an unofficial advocate for the family. "That little girl needs you strong." "I can't leave her," Dot whispered, clutching Grace's limp hand. "She's all I have left in this world." At home, the 4 German shepherds were experiencing their own form of distress. Duke had positioned himself by the front door, refusing to move except for essential needs. His dark eyes remained fixed on the entrance, waiting for Grace's return with a devotion that bordered on obsessive. Belle, Scout, and Faith paced restlessly through the house, their usual discipline replaced by obvious anxiety. They'd stopped eating regular meals, picking listlessly at their food before returning to their vigil. The community's response to Grace's hospitalization revealed the deep fractures that had developed over the past weeks. Martha Williams organized prayer vigils at the hospital while Bobby Chen found himself questioning everything he'd believed about the situation. The sight of the empty house on Maple Street, with its 4 dogs visible through the windows like loyal sentinels, had begun to haunt his daily runs. Pastor Miller attempted to bridge the growing divide during his Sunday sermon, speaking about compassion and community responsibility without directly naming the Bennett family. "Sometimes," he said from the pulpit, "we become so focused on protecting ourselves from potential dangers that we forget to protect the vulnerable among us from certain harm." The message resonated with some congregants while alienating others. Helen Crawford walked out mid-service, her disapproval evident to everyone present. But several families approached Pastor Miller afterward, asking how they could help Grace and her grandmother. Dr. Sarah Kim returned to the hospital on Tuesday with troubling news from her research. She'd discovered inconsistencies in the official reports from the night Grace's mother died, gaps in the timeline that suggested important details had been omitted or classified. Her attempts to contact the responding officers had been met with bureaucratic stonewalling, as if someone had decided certain information was too sensitive to share. "There's something about that night that people don't want discussed," Dr. Kim told Jennifer Martinez as they observed Grace through the window of her room. "The child's attachment to these dogs isn't random. Something happened that created this bond, and until we understand what it was, we're treating symptoms instead of causes." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Williams, frustrated by the official silence surrounding Grace's case, had spent hours at the Cedar Falls Library researching newspaper archives and police reports. Her persistence paid off when she discovered a brief mention in the Des Moines Register from 6 months earlier. Police K-9 unit responds to domestic violence fatality. The article was sparse on details, mentioning only that a woman had been killed by her husband in a domestic dispute, that a child had been present, and that police K-9 units had been involved in the response. But it was enough to give Martha a starting point for further investigation. She began making phone calls, using her decades of experience as a teacher to navigate bureaucratic systems with patient determination. It took 3 days and 15 different conversations, but eventually she reached Officer James Rodriguez of the Des Moines Police Department, Duke's former handler. "Ma'am, I can't discuss active cases," Officer Rodriguez said initially, "but if you're calling about Duke, how is he?" "We heard he was retired to a family situation." "Officer Rodriguez, there's a little girl in the hospital right now who might die without that dog. If there's anything you can tell me that might help her case—" The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Martha wondered if the connection had been lost. When Officer Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that confirmed her suspicions. "Duke saved that little girl's life. What happened that night? It was one of the worst domestic calls I've ever responded to. The father had suffered a complete psychotic break, and by the time we arrived, the mother was already gone." Martha's hand tightened on the phone. "And Grace?" "Hidden in a bedroom closet, covered in her mother's blood, catatonic with terror. Duke found her when our human officers couldn't. He stayed with her through the entire crime scene processing, wouldn't let anyone else near her until she felt safe. The department psychiatrist said it was the strongest human-animal bond she'd ever witnessed. The revelation changed everything. Martha immediately called Pastor Miller, who contacted Dr. Kim, who rushed to the hospital with new understanding of Grace's condition. The child wasn't simply attached to her dogs. She was reliving the trauma of separation from her primary source of security and comfort. "We need to get Duke here," Dr. Kim told Dr. Thompson urgently. "This isn't just preference, it's medical necessity." That dog is her therapeutic anchor. Dr. Thompson's initial resistance crumbled when Grace's condition worsened that evening. The child's blood pressure had dropped to dangerous levels, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. With conventional treatment options exhausted, the medical team found themselves facing a choice between strict hospital policy and a patient's life. The decision was made at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday night. Officer Rodriguez, who had driven 3 hours after Martha's call, walked through the hospital corridors with Duke at his side. The big German Shepherd wore his retired service vest, his official credentials, clearing bureaucratic obstacles that had seemed insurmountable hours earlier. Grace's response to Duke's presence was immediate and dramatic. The moment the dog entered her room, her vital signs began stabilizing. When Duke approached her bed and rested his massive head on the mattress beside her, Grace's eyes focused for the first time in days. Her hand moved slowly to stroke his familiar fur, and she whispered her first words since the hospitalization. "I knew you'd come back." Dr. Thompson watched the monitors in amazement as Grace's heart rate returned to normal ranges and her blood pressure stabilized. "In all my years of medicine, I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to the gathered observers. "That dog is better than any medication we've tried." The transformation continued over the following hours. With Duke lying beside her bed, Grace accepted her first real meal in days. She began responding to medical staff and even managed a small smile when Nancy Coleman brought her a coloring book. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable hours earlier began to resolve with Duke's steady presence. Bobby Chen heard about Duke's hospital visit and felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the grief-fueled anger that had driven his crusade against the Bennett family. Standing in his son's former bedroom, surrounded by the toys and books that remained exactly as Tommy had left them, he remembered his boy's final weeks in this same hospital. How desperately he would have welcomed anything that could have brought Tommy comfort. "I've been fighting the wrong battle," he whispered to his wife that night. "Those dogs aren't the enemy. They're exactly what that little girl needs." The revelation of Duke's heroic background spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, carried by Martha Williams' network of friends and Pastor Miller's congregation. The German Shepherd, who had been viewed as a potential threat, was revealed as a decorated police hero who had saved Grace's life not once but twice, first from her father's violence and now from the trauma of separation. By Thursday morning, the community's attitude had undergone a complete reversal. The same people who had signed Bobby's petition demanding the dog's removal now lined up to sign Martha's new petition supporting the family. Donations poured in from across the state as news of Grace's story spread through social media and local news outlets. Grace was discharged Friday afternoon with Duke at her side and a comprehensive treatment plan that acknowledged the therapeutic necessity of her four-legged guardians. As they walked out of the hospital together, Grace's whispered words to Duke carried a promise that touched everyone who heard them. "We're going home now, all of us together." The homecoming should have been a celebration, but it brought news that shattered what little hope remained. While Grace had been fighting for her life in the hospital, the foreclosure proceedings had accelerated with ruthless efficiency. A notice taped to the front door announced that the property would be auctioned in just 7 days unless the full amount of back taxes, now totaling $8,247 with accumulated penalties, was paid immediately. Dot stood on her own front porch, holding the official document with trembling hands, while Grace pressed against her side and Duke maintained his protective stance. The community support that had seemed so promising during Grace's hospitalization suddenly felt inadequate against the cold mathematics of legal deadlines and municipal bureaucracy. 7 days, Dot whispered, the words catching in her throat. After 50 years in this house, we have 7 days." Grace's recovery had been remarkable but fragile. The child had gained back some weight and begun speaking in short sentences, but her stability remained entirely dependent on routine and the presence of her 4 guardians. The thought of another upheaval, of losing the only home she'd known since her mother's death, sent visible tremors through her small frame. Martha Williams arrived within the hour, her arms full of grocery bags and her expression grim with determination. "Don't you dare give up," she told Dot firmly as she began unpacking food in the kitchen. "That GoFundMe account has raised over $3,000 since Grace got out of the hospital. People all over the state are contributing." But even as Martha spoke with forced optimism, both women understood the mathematical reality. $3,000, while generous, left them more than $5,000 short, with less than a week remaining. The kind of money they needed didn't exist in their small community, where most families were struggling with their own financial pressures. The Harrisons returned that afternoon with renewed urgency, their previous interest now sharpened by the foreclosure crisis. Susan Harrison's smile held a brittle quality as she surveyed the modest living room where Grace sat surrounded by her dogs. "We heard about your housing situation," Richard Harrison said with practiced sympathy. "This actually presents an opportunity to resolve everyone's problems. Grace needs stability, and you need financial relief." They'd increased their offer substantially, not just adoption, but a generous monthly stipend for Dot's living expenses if she agreed to relinquish custody voluntarily. "We understand the dogs are important to Grace," Susan added. "We've researched therapeutic animal programs. Once she's settled with us, we can arrange supervised visits with appropriate animals." Grace's reaction to this news was swift and devastating. She retreated to her bedroom with Duke, Belle, Scout, and Faith, arranging themselves in their familiar protective formation around her. Through the thin walls, Dot could hear her granddaughter's whispered conversations with Duke, the words too soft to make out, but the anguish in her voice unmistakable. That evening brought the worst news yet. Dr. Kim called with the results of her investigation into the Harrisons' background. The circumstances beyond their control that had ended their previous adoption attempt weren't mysterious bureaucratic delays, as they'd suggested. Their 12-year-old nephew had filed a detailed complaint about punishment sessions in the basement, describing hours of standing at attention and verbal humiliation for minor infractions. The case was ultimately dismissed due to lack of corroborating evidence, Dr. Kim explained to Dot over the phone. But the boy's descriptions were very specific and disturbing. He mentioned being told that showing emotion was weakness, that proper children should be seen and not heard. Dot's blood ran cold as she remembered Grace's compliant behavior around the Harrisons, not the comfortable trust she'd hoped to see, but the hyper-vigilant obedience of a child who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible. "Dr. Kim, what do I do? If I lose this house, they're our only option." "Mrs. Bennett, there are other possibilities. Foster families, group homes designed for traumatized children. None of them ideal, but safer than—" "None of them will take 4 large dogs," Dot interrupted. "And Grace won't survive another separation from Duke. I've seen what happens when they're apart." The weekend became a blur of desperate phone calls and increasingly frantic fundraising efforts. Pastor Miller organized a church-wide collection that raised another $800. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Grace's situation that generated donations from as far away as Chicago and Milwaukee. Even Bobby Chen, transformed by guilt and newfound understanding, contributed his family's entire vacation fund. $2,000 they'd been saving for a trip to Disney World, but by Sunday evening, the total still fell short by nearly $3,000. Dot sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by cards and letters from strangers who'd been moved by Grace's story, calculating and recalculating numbers that refused to add up to salvation. Grace found her there near midnight, having slipped out of bed with Duke padding silently beside her. "Grandma Dot, are we going to lose our house?" The direct question stripped away any pretense of protection. Dot looked into those blue eyes that had seen too much already and made a choice for honesty. "I don't know, baby girl. I'm trying everything I can think of, but sometimes trying isn't enough." Grace climbed into her grandmother's lap, fitting herself into the familiar space where she'd found comfort during so many previous crises. "If we have to go away, will Duke and Belle and Scout and Faith come with us?" "I don't know that either, sweetheart. The people who want to adopt you, they have a big house and lots of money, but they don't understand about the dogs." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her small hand stroking Duke's massive head where it rested on Dot's knee. When she finally spoke, her words carried a maturity that broke her grandmother's heart. "The dogs saved me from the monster," Grace whispered. "Now I want to save them too. But I don't know how." Monday morning brought a parade of officials, bank representatives, city assessors, and representatives from Child Protective Services, all performing their bureaucratic duties with professional efficiency that felt like cruelty. Grace watched from her bedroom window as strangers walked through their yard, measuring and photographing everything that would soon belong to someone else. The breaking point came when a real estate agent arrived to begin preparing the property for auction. A middle-aged woman in an expensive suit, she walked through the house making notes about improvements needed for marketability, while Grace and her dogs huddled in the corner of the living room. "The carpeting will need to be replaced," the agent announced to Dot. "Pet odors are a serious deterrent to potential buyers, and that fence in the backyard is falling down. It'll need to be removed entirely." Grace's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She began to hyperventilate, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as panic overwhelmed her small body. Duke responded instantly, pressing his solid bulk against her while Belle and Scout moved to block the agent's view. Faith began the low, rhythmic panting that had proven therapeutic during Grace's previous episodes. "Ma'am, those animals need to be removed from the premises during showings," the agent continued, oblivious to the crisis unfolding before her. "Most people are uncomfortable around large dogs, especially breeds with aggressive reputations." That was the moment something snapped inside Dot Bennett. This tiny woman who'd spent her life being polite and accommodating, who'd apologized for taking up space and asked permission for her own existence, suddenly found a reservoir of fierce protectiveness she didn't know she possessed. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice carrying a steel edge that made the real estate agent look up from her clipboard. "Get out of my house, get out of my yard, and don't come back until you have the legal right to be here." The agent sputtered about professional obligations and legal procedures, but Dot had stopped listening. She gathered Grace into her arms while Duke and the other dogs maintained their protective formation, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. "We're not giving up yet, baby girl," she whispered into Grace's blonde hair. "Not until the very last minute. Not until every possibility is exhausted." Outside, the real estate agent made notes about difficult occupants and potential delays in possession, unaware that she'd just awakened something formidable in the most unlikely of warriors. The miracle began with an unexpected phone call on Tuesday morning, just 3 days before the foreclosure deadline. Martha Williams had been relentless in her pursuit of Duke's background, and her persistence had finally yielded extraordinary results. Officer James Rodriguez was driving to Cedar Falls with documentation that would change everything they thought they knew about Grace's protectors. "Mrs. Bennett," Martha's voice crackled with excitement over the phone, "you need to sit down for this. Duke isn't just any retired police dog. He's a decorated hero with 3 commendations for life-saving actions. And those other 3 dogs, Belle, Scout, and Faith, They're not just pets, they're his offspring, all bred and partially trained for protective services. Dot sank into her kitchen chair, Grace curled in her lap with Duke's massive head resting on their knees. What does that mean for us? It means Duke has an official service record that could qualify him as a therapeutic animal. It means there are veterans organizations and police benevolent funds that support retired canine heroes. Most importantly, it means Grace's bond with these dogs isn't unusual. It's exactly what Duke was trained to create with trauma victims. Officer Rodriguez arrived that afternoon in his personal vehicle, having taken vacation time to make the trip. A stocky man in his early 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands, he knelt immediately when Duke approached, running his fingers over scars that told stories of dangerous missions and heroic rescues. "There's my partner," Rodriguez murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I wondered if you remembered me, boy." Duke's response was unlike anything Grace had witnessed before. The stoic German shepherd who maintained constant vigilance began to whimper softly, his tail moving in careful wags as he pressed against his former handler. It was Belle who seemed most affected by the reunion, moving restlessly around the group and whining as if trying to communicate something urgent. "Officer Rodriguez," Dr. Kim said, having arrived to witness Duke's official evaluation, "can you tell us about the night Duke found Grace?" Rodriguez's expression darkened as he settled into Dot's worn armchair, Duke positioning himself protectively between the officer and Grace. "Worst domestic call I ever responded to. Michael Bennett had suffered a complete psychotic break, paranoid schizophrenia triggered by financial stress, and untreated depression. By the time we arrived, his wife was already dead, and we couldn't locate the child." Grace's breathing began to quicken at the familiar recounting of that terrible night, but Duke immediately pressed closer, his warm bulk providing the grounding she needed to remain present. The house was a crime scene, blood everywhere, furniture overturned, evidence of a violent struggle. We searched for 40 minutes before Duke indicated he'd found something in the master bedroom. Hidden in the back of a closet covered in her mother's blood was this little girl. Rodriguez paused, his voice catching. Grace wouldn't let any of us near her, not the paramedics, not the child psychologists, not even the female officers. She'd just scream if anyone tried to approach, but Duke, somehow he knew exactly what she needed. "What did he do?" Dr. Kim asked softly. "He lay down in front of the closet and waited, just waited, completely still, until Grace stopped screaming. Then he started this low humming sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something I'd never heard him do before. After about an hour, Grace reached out and touched his nose. The room fell silent, except for Grace's whispered words to Duke. "You saved me from the monster." Rodriguez nodded. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Duke refused to leave her side during the crime scene processing, the hospital evaluation, even during the initial custody hearings. The department psychiatrist said it was the strongest trauma bond she'd ever documented between a human and an animal. Dr. Kim leaned forward. "What happened to Grace's father?" "Michael Bennett was ruled mentally incompetent to stand trial. He's in a secure psychiatric facility, probably for the rest of his life. The break was so severe that he doesn't even remember that night, doesn't remember having a wife or daughter." Grace's small voice cut through the heavy atmosphere. "Is the monster still there?" "In the place where they keep him." Rodriguez's expression softened as he met the child's eyes directly. "The monster is gone, sweetheart. Your daddy is still sick, but the part of him that hurt people isn't there anymore. Duke made sure of that." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, car doors slamming and voices raised in heated discussion. Through the front window, they could see Bobby Chen arguing with a man in an expensive suit while several other vehicles pulled up to the house. "What's all this about?" Dot wondered aloud, moving to peer through the curtains. Bobby Chen's voice carried clearly as he approached the front door. "I don't care what your investors think about the timeline. This family isn't going anywhere until we've exhausted every option." The man in the suit, later identified as Marcus Webb, a property developer from Des Moines, followed Bobby onto the porch with obvious frustration. "Mr. Chen, you called this meeting? I've driven 2 hours to discuss a potential purchase, and now you're telling me you've changed your mind?" Bobby knocked firmly before entering without waiting for permission, his face flushed with excitement and determination. "Mrs. Bennett, I need you to hear this. All of you need to hear this." Webb entered reluctantly, his calculating gaze sweeping over the modest interior before settling on the 4 German shepherds with obvious distaste. "As I told Mr. Chen, my company specializes in converting older properties into rental units. We're prepared to offer significantly above market value for a quick closing." "How much above market value?" Martha Williams asked sharply, having arrived moments earlier. 15% premium for a 7-day closing. That would put our offer at approximately $12,000. Dot's sharp intake of breath was audible. $12,000 would not only cover the back taxes, but leave enough for basic living expenses for several months. "But," Webb continued, "the offer is contingent on immediate possession. We need to begin renovations within 2 weeks, and we can't have current occupants interfering with construction schedules." Grace looked confused at the adult conversation swirling around her, but Duke's sudden tension suggested he understood the implications better than anyone. Where would they go? What would happen to the dogs? Bobby Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying new authority. "Mr. Webb, I need to be completely honest with you. When I contacted your company, I was thinking only about solving a property tax problem. I didn't understand the full situation." Webb's impatience was evident. "Mr. Chen, real estate transactions aren't emotional decisions. This family's personal circumstances aren't relevant to our business arrangement." "That's where you're wrong," Bobby said firmly. "Everything about this situation is relevant. This isn't just a house. It's the home of a traumatized child and the service dog who saved her life. Breaking up this family would be unconscionable." Rodriguez stood, his officer's bearing commanding attention in the crowded room. "Mr. Webb, are you familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act provisions regarding service animals?" Webb's expression shifted to wariness. "I'm familiar with basic regulations, yes." "Then you should know that Duke here is a decorated police K-9 with documented therapeutic necessity for a trauma victim. Any attempt to separate them could constitute discrimination under federal law." The developer's confidence began to waver as he reassessed the situation. "This is becoming far more complicated than a simple property acquisition. Doctor." Kim spoke up from her position near Grace. "Mr. Webb, I'm a licensed child psychologist working with this family. I can provide documentation that Grace's attachment to these animals isn't preference, it's medical necessity. Disrupting this arrangement could result in serious psychological harm." Grace, sensing the adult's tension, even if she didn't understand the specifics, began to show signs of distress. Her breathing quickened, and she pressed closer to Duke while Belle and Scout moved into protective positions. "Stop," Dot said quietly, her voice cutting through the debate. "Everyone just stop." The room fell silent as all attention focused on the elderly woman who'd been largely sidelined during the discussion of her family's fate. "Mr. Webb, I appreciate your offer, but we won't be accepting it. This house has been my home for 50 years, and it's the only stability my granddaughter has known since her world fell apart. We'll find another way." Webb's relief was obvious. "Mrs. Bennett, I respect your decision, but I should warn you that opportunities like this don't come along often. If you change your mind after the foreclosure—" "We won't change our minds," Martha Williams interrupted. Because we're not giving up. There are still 3 days left, and this community hasn't finished fighting yet. As Webb gathered his materials to leave, Bobby Chen followed him onto the porch. Their conversation was brief but heated, with Bobby's gestures becoming increasingly animated before Webb drove away with obvious frustration. "What was that about?" Pastor Miller asked, as Bobby returned to the living room. Bobby's grin was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. "I just told Mr. Webb that if he wanted to develop property in Cedar Falls, he'd better think twice about destroying our most inspiring family. Word gets around in small towns, and his company's reputation could take a serious hit if people knew he'd displaced a traumatized child and her therapy dogs." Rodriguez, who'd been quietly making phone calls in the corner, approached the group with news that made everyone freeze. "I've been in contact with the Police Benevolent Association and the K-9 Veteran Support Fund. Duke's service record qualifies him for several different assistance programs." "What kind of assistance?" Dot asked hesitantly. "Emergency housing support for retired K-9 families, medical care subsidies, and—" Rodriguez paused for dramatic effect. "A one-time settlement payment for extraordinary service." Duke's actions saving Grace weren't just heroic. They were above and beyond his normal duties. Grace looked up at the adults with growing hope in her eyes. "Does that mean Duke gets a reward?" "It means," Rodriguez said, kneeling to her level, "that Duke's reward is making sure you and Grandma Dot can stay in your home together." The settlement amount, $6,500, combined with the community donations, would cover the back taxes with money left over for basic expenses. But more importantly, it came with official documentation of Duke's status as a therapeutic service animal, protecting the family from future challenges about the dog's presence. As the good news sank in, Grace did something she hadn't done since before her mother's death. She laughed. A clear, bright sound that filled the room with joy and brought tears to every adult present. Duke's tail wagged for the first time anyone could remember, while Belle, Scout, and Faith seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their postures relaxing from constant vigilance to something closer to peace. Bobby Chen approached Dot with obvious emotion. "Mrs. Bennett, I owe you and Grace an apology that goes deeper than words can express. I let my grief over losing Tommy blind me to what real love looks like." Dot reached out and took his hand. "Bobby, grief makes us all do things we regret. What matters is that you found your way back to kindness." "I want to do more than apologize," Bobby continued. "I want to help. My wife Sarah and we'd like to be part of Grace's support system. Honorary grandparents, if you'll have us." Grace looked up at Bobby with curious eyes. "Did you have a little boy who went to heaven?" Bobby's voice broke slightly as he nodded. "His name was Tommy. He was 8 years old and he loved dogs just like you do." "I think Tommy would like Duke," Grace said solemnly. "Dogs are good at helping people not be sad." The simple wisdom of a 6-year-old's observation brought healing to wounds that had festered for years, proving once again that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most profound truths. The celebration began at dawn on Friday morning, the day that would have marked the loss of everything the Bennett family held dear. Instead, it became the day Cedar Falls discovered what miracles look like when an entire community decides to choose love over fear. Grace woke to the sound of vehicles pulling into their driveway and voices calling out cheerful greetings from the front yard. "Grandma Dot," Grace whispered, padding into the kitchen where her grandmother stood at the window with tears streaming down her face. "Why are all those people here?" Through the glass they could see neighbors, church members, and even strangers carrying casseroles, balloons, and handmade signs reading, "Welcome home, Grace and Duke," and "Heroes live here." Martha Williams directed the organized chaos with the efficiency of a former teacher, while Pastor Miller helped Bobby Chen string up colorful banners between the oak trees in the front yard. Officer Rodriguez had returned from Des Moines with official documentation that transformed their legal status entirely. Duke now carried certification as a registered therapeutic service animal with Bell, Scout, and Faith listed as support animals in training. The paperwork would protect them from future discrimination and ensured that Grace could take Duke to school, medical appointments, and anywhere else their bond might provide therapeutic benefit. "It's official," Rodriguez announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Duke's service record has been updated to reflect his current assignment, full-time guardian and therapeutic partner to Grace Bennett. No municipal ordinance or housing restriction can separate them now. Grace's response was to bury her face in Duke's thick fur and whisper words only he could hear. The big German shepherd's tail moved in careful wags, as if he understood the significance of the moment as clearly as any human present. Dr. Kim arrived with her final assessment report and news that brought even more stability to their situation. "I've recommended that Grace remain in her current placement indefinitely," she announced to Dot with a smile. "My evaluation shows remarkable progress in her emotional development since the hospitalization. The therapeutic bond with her animals is facilitating healing that conventional treatment methods couldn't achieve." The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy their family was now resolved through a combination of community generosity and official recognition of Duke's heroic service. The Police Benevolent Association settlement had covered the back taxes entirely, while ongoing donations from across the state had established a trust fund for Grace's future education and medical needs. Bobby Chen stood before the assembled crowd with the humility of a man who'd learned profound lessons about the difference between protection and prejudice. "3 months ago, I stood in a room full of neighbors and demanded that this family's dogs be removed from our streets. I was wrong, not just mistaken, but fundamentally wrong about what constitutes danger in our community." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The real danger wasn't 4 well-trained dogs protecting a traumatized child. The real danger was a community so focused on imaginary threats that we almost destroyed the very thing that should inspire us most: unconditional love in action." Sarah Chen approached Grace with a wrapped package, her nurse's training evident in the gentle way she knelt to the child's eye level. "This was Tommy's," she said softly, helping Grace unwrap a well-loved copy of Where the Red Fern Grows. "He always said it was the best book about the love between children and dogs." "We thought you might like to have it." Grace accepted the book with the reverence due to a sacred gift, running her small fingers over the worn cover. "Will you tell me about Tommy?" she asked, with the directness that children bring to important questions. "He was brave like you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And he would have loved Duke and Belle and Scout and Faith. He always said dogs were angels with fur and wet noses." The day's events had been carefully planned to avoid overwhelming Grace while still celebrating the community's transformation. Martha Williams had organized activities that honored both the family's privacy and the neighbors' desire to show support. Children from the elementary school had made drawings of dogs that now decorated the fence around the backyard. The high school art class had painted a beautiful mural on the garage depicting Grace and her 4 guardians in a field of wildflowers. Pastor Miller offered a blessing that captured the spiritual significance of their journey together. "Lord, we thank you for teaching us that families come in all shapes and sizes, that healing often arrives on 4 legs, and that love multiplied becomes miracles. Bless this house, this child, this remarkable woman who opened her heart when others closed theirs, and these faithful animals who prove every day that your messengers don't always have wings." As afternoon mellowed into evening, The crowd gradually thinned until only the closest supporters remained. Grace sat on the front porch steps with Duke beside her, watching Belle, Scout, and Faith play in the yard with a freedom they hadn't shown in months. The constant tension that had defined their lives was finally beginning to ease. Dot emerged from the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and settled beside her granddaughter with a contentment she hadn't felt in years. The financial pressure was gone, the legal threats had evaporated, and most importantly, their family remained intact and protected. "Grandma Dot," Grace said thoughtfully, "are we safe now? Really safe?" "As safe as love can make us, baby girl. And we've got more love surrounding us than I ever imagined possible." Grace considered this wisdom while absently stroking Duke's ears. "I think Mommy would be happy that Duke saved us. She always said dogs were the best people." The simple profundity of the observation brought fresh tears to Dot's eyes, but these were tears of healing rather than grief. Grace was beginning to speak of her mother without the paralyzing fear that had characterized her earlier memories, integrating the loss into a narrative that included hope and continuity. Dr. Kim made one final visit that evening, bringing official documentation that would ensure Grace's continued stability. "I've never seen such remarkable progress in a trauma case," she told Dot privately. "Grace has not only survived her experiences, she's beginning to thrive. The bond with Duke isn't just therapeutic, it's transformative." The evening concluded with an unexpected gesture from the Cedar Falls City Council. Mayor Patricia Hendricks arrived with a proclamation declaring Duke an official canine hero of Cedar Falls, complete with a ceremonial key to the city. The document would be framed and hung in the town hall, ensuring that future generations would know the story of the police dog who saved a little girl and taught a community about the true meaning of courage. As the last visitors departed and the Bennett household settled into peaceful quiet, Grace performed her nightly ritual of saying goodnight to each of her guardians. Duke received the longest conversation, conducted in whispers that remained private between girl and dog. Belle, Scout, and Faith accepted their briefer but equally heartfelt acknowledgments before settling into their protective positions around Grace's bed. Dot stood in the doorway watching this scene that had become as essential to her granddaughter's well-being as breathing. The sight of Grace surrounded by loyal protectors, safe in the house that had sheltered 5 decades of family memories, represented a victory that transcended mere survival. They had not only endured, they had found their way to something approaching peace. The transformation was complete when Grace spoke her prayers aloud for the first time since her mother's death. "God, thank you for Duke and Belle and Scout and Faith. Thank you for Grandma Dot and all the nice people who helped us stay together. And thank you for making the scared feelings smaller than the love feelings." As Grace drifted off to sleep with Duke's steady breathing beside her, Dot whispered her own prayer of gratitude into the darkness. They had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged with their bonds strengthened rather than broken. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this house filled with the quiet contentment of a family reunited and secure, they had everything they needed. The little girl who walked her dogs daily had taught an entire community that sometimes the most profound truths come in the smallest packages, and that love, real, unconditional, protective love, always finds a way to triumph over fear. Their story would be told for generations in Cedar Falls, a reminder that miracles still happen when ordinary people choose extraordinary compassion. In the morning, Grace would wake up at home, surrounded by the 4-legged angels who had saved her life in more ways than one. And in that moment of peaceful awakening, the healing would continue, one day at a time, one walk at a time, one act of love at a time. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about conquering mountains or achieving fame. They're about ordinary people discovering that love multiplies when we choose compassion over fear. Grace and Duke's journey reminds us that families aren't always defined by blood, that healing often comes on four legs, and that communities grow stronger when they protect their most vulnerable members. In a world that often feels divided and harsh, their story proves that small acts of kindness can create miracles, that second chances exist for those brave enough to admit their mistakes, and that the bonds forged through adversity often become our greatest treasures. Dot's fierce love for her granddaughter, Bobby's journey from fear to understanding, and Duke's unwavering loyalty show us that it's never too late to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation. When we open our hearts to unlikely heroes, whether they walk on two legs or four, we discover that the very things we thought threatened us might actually be the gifts we needed most. Grace's whispered prayers and Duke's patient presence remind us that happiness isn't found in perfection, but in the quiet moments when we realize we're exactly where we belong, surrounded by those who would protect us with their lives. What unexpected angels have appeared in your own life during difficult times? Have you ever discovered that something you initially feared turned out to be exactly what you needed? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love and loyalty have shown up in your life.